Reconstructing philosophy. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Reconstructing Philosophy podcast. Today we have Angella Yamamoto from the University of Waterloo. Angela is interested in the philosophy of biology and epistemology, the philosophy of science more broadly speaking, and the interaction between science and society. She relatively recently defended her master's thesis, Collaborative Scientific Knowledge and Testimonial Justification. Thanks for coming on to discuss your work, Angela.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, as always, I kind of want to start again just by asking you, how have you found philosophy during the time of the lockdown?
It's been interesting, especially because I moved back to my hometown in Edmonton, Alberta. So that didn't change so much in terms of my interaction with philosophy people, but it did change in terms of kind of being better situated in a place where I felt comfortable, and then that allowed me to kind of focus on my philosophy more. So that was, I guess, one of the benefits maybe of doing philosophy in the lockdown, is that instead of being away from my family, I got to be closer to them.
So you found that helps your working process more, or?
Yeah, it does, because I have that like added support and kind of that ability to take a break. Philosophy can get a little heavy sometimes, especially some of the questions that I'm asking just boggle my mind, and I don't have answers, and I start freaking out. And having your family there to be like, hey, make sure you come for dinner, makes it a little bit nicer. So yeah.
Yeah, it's always helpful to get that kind of breakaway from philosophy. I mean, I suppose for some people it's the lockdown might have been more of a break from philosophy than for others, depending on their circumstances. But it certainly is it's a tricky time to try to work, because on the one hand, to some extent you're at home and you have nothing else to do, but on the other hand, you're not talking to people in the field either. So
yeah, it was an interesting learning process to learn to work from home. I am a fan of doing philosophy in coffee shops and around other people, and so trying to get myself into kind of that more philosophical mood was a little bit more difficult. A little bit of a learning curve in terms of other people realizing that I'm not just sitting at home doing nothing. I am actually working. Having my dog around helps, though. So,
I
as
bet.
always. Yeah, I definitely miss the face-to-face discussions and the interactions that you get in philosophy classes and in philosophy discussions and seminars. That's one of my favorite parts of philosophy, is being able to sit in a room with a bunch of like-minded people discussing weird concepts or interesting concepts and really diving deep into what they mean. And obviously you don't get that same kind of connection over the internet.
Yeah, it's not quite the same. I mean, even just quick conversations, sort of water cooler type conversations, you can't really have.
Yeah, and like the University of Waterloo, sometimes people would gather in the lunchroom and have discussions there, or being able to pop into someone's office and have a conversation about something, touch base with your supervisors in person, I find has been one thing that would have been really nice. But we do what we can.
Well, I mean, hopefully things are heading on the up and up over the next few months, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. So how did you get into philosophy in the first place? I think let's start with that kind of question.
Sure. It's a very interesting story. It starts with me wanting to get my PhD in genetics, and realizing that as I was taking my genetics courses and science courses and biology courses in general leading up to that, I was asking all these philosophical questions about where it all came from, what it all means, what's it tell you about the world, and my genetics professors and my biology professors were like, these are not the questions we kind of like really are focusing on here. There's a department across the way, across campus. You should go ask them. So I, like many philosophers of science, started in the science, realized that my science grades were going down as my philosophy grades were increasing. Ended up doing both degrees, and yeah, landed in philosophy in the end.
Are you sure you didn't get into philosophy for all the fame and fortune instead of genetics?
Oh yes, it was because I knew that I could make tens of dollars while I was a philosopher, and that I could, lie on this mountain of debt. But yeah,
But hey, what even is currency, anyways?
exactly. Now, who knows? What does money look like? I don't even remember. I don't want to touch it because it might have so many different.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. I mean, I don't often tend to carry cash on me, anyways. So
Yeah.
anyways.
I used to in the coffee shop because paying $3 for your coffee and on a card seemed kind of weird, but
So you left genetics for philosophy. So you're interested in philosophy of science. What outside, like, are there areas outside of science that you have interest in terms of philosophy, or like not necessarily ones that you might study, but maybe something you'd like to study or something else?
Right, yeah. I was also really interested in like just knowledge in general and where it all came from, and how we knew everything and how we proved everything. So epistemology, actually the first course I ever took was an epistemology course, and the professor was like, are you sure you want to jump into philosophy in this way? Because it's a pretty, like, you're diving into the deep end of the ocean. Like, this is a pretty big step. And I was like, yeah, I'll be fine. I was okay. Only a little bit lost. I haven't done a lot of like kind of more Eastern philosophies or non-Western philosophies, and I'd really like to branch out and kind of see what those philosophies entail and if it's different or similar or something like that.
And maybe in what ways there might be similarities and differences. Do they have conflicting mediating models?
Exactly. Do they have philosophy of science? What does it look like?
So
you started off in genetics and then got into philosophy after that. So to some extent, my follow-up to this question about why this work fascinates you is already answered. But what are you working on right now?
Sure. So it's kind of weird. Like, so how do you go from genetics into philosophy of science and then all the way over to like this metaphysical question is what I'm working on right now. Especially because my master's thesis, as you mentioned earlier, was on testimonial justification and collaborative knowledge. So you're like, okay, that kind of makes some sense. As far as you can tell, science is done in a lab, so there might be some sort of testimony going on there between lab mates and stuff like that. Right now, I'm actually working on whether there's a version of structural realism or structural empiricism that applies to biology. Current theories in structural realism and empiricism focus very heavily on physics and chemistry and things that have really nice math formulas that you can look at. So I was like, oh, that sounds really like a thing that you could maybe do in biology. I wonder if you could. How did I get started on it?
How do you go from genetics to like realism or to structural realism?
Yeah. I think it started when I was questioning, the role of values in science. And I started saying, like, okay, if values are present in science, what exactly is science discovering? and what does that tell us about the world if our values maybe sometimes influence what we're talking about? And so beyond this question of, just ethical issues, I was like, I wonder if our values actually, if there is something else that's also affecting our science. And so I went and said, like, is it how we define our knowledge? Maybe a little bit. So I looked at the testimony stuff. And then I started talking about this, like, okay, so what is science really studying? And a lot of people say, well, they're studying the real world. And then I said, well, what is the real world? And there are many answers to that question, depending on which philosophical tradition you like to follow. And so then I was like, okay, what are all of these different theories we can apply to the real world? And they kept talking about physics. And I was like, okay, well, I get that you're talking about physics, but physics is not the only science. And then I was like, do you talk about anything else? And they're like, well, we talk about math sometimes. I was like, okay, do you talk about anything else? And they're like, not really. There's a few things where we've talked about what's real in other things, but in terms of what's real in biology, it seems like there's less. At least I haven't been familiarized with the literature on it. I'm sure there's lots out there to discover. But when I started looking at this structural picture, I didn't find as much as I had hoped. And so that's where my current project ended up. Part of it was like me just being interested in realism and anti-realism. I took a class on it, got super into it, and then started asking why it's not applied to biology when it seemed to fit so well. Structural realism, that is. And yeah, here I am.
So it sounds like what essentially what you're doing in your work is trying to sort of take a framework or sort of an understanding that's been developed when it comes to physics and math, and then trying to apply that to other sciences as well. Is that right?
Yeah, because it's a metaphysical theory about what the real world is like. It theoretically, in my mind, would apply to any sort of thing that studies the real world. Biology studies the real world. I would like to agree with that. So yeah, it's moving this framework to see if it's actually plausible.
So maybe can you try to describe a little bit more in a little bit more detail what exactly you're doing then? So what is structural realism, and what does it mean to talk about reality in the context of biology?
Right. Those are great questions. Part of what I am working on. So structural realism, I guess, started with an author named John Worrell. Came out with this kind of theory in how do I want to put this? So yeah, John Worrell was responding to the claim that in the history of science, there's many occasions when it appears that we had theories that were scientific and that we have now jettisoned from our science. And Worrell is saying, well, it's not so much that we jettisoned the whole theory. It's that we took parts of the theory and kept that, and we just got rid of stuff that didn't quite fit with what we were observing and what we were seeing and what our scientific experiments were telling us. And what we were keeping is this underlying structure. And then how we defined what we were talking about changed based on the theory. So structural realism kind of focuses on that. I actually had the pleasure of speaking with James Ladyman this morning about structural realism. and he puts forward an ontic structural realist view, which is just a fancy name for saying that he believes that there are real structures in the world. And it for me, I'm still working through how exactly to define it, and I think people are still working through how exactly to define structural realism. Either way, the realism part of it is fairly well still holds to the standard realism definitions, where the theory argues that metaphysically the world is real, mind independent of sorts. When it comes to scientific realism, it's I guess the traditional definition is that our best scientific theories tell us true or approximately true things about the world. And then anti-realism says that our best scientific theories may tell us true things about the real world, but we don't know for sure. And so they don't commit to this real world actually existing. I think is probably the best way to define that.
So if I was somebody new to this, right?
Yeah.
So essentially, what you're kind of getting at is that I suppose people typically tend to think that when science investigates a subject, that they find out something real about the world, right?
Yeah.
Phil and I were talking about this last week in the context of atoms, right? Where if you're talking about things like electrons and stuff, you can't directly observe them necessarily. So therefore, the question is, how do those things really exist, right? In a real sense, right? So there's that question about what things out there are real, and does science actually investigate those things? But on top of that, there's this other issue of the fact that science seems to change its views a lot, right?
Yeah, that's
and
correct.
so there's this whole debate about, well, why, if this is the case, right, then why should we think that science is approaching reality any more than we thought it had in the past before we changed our mind about those things, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
The structural realist is the one who says that the kinds of things that are real are the structures, and so the structures carry over through some of these transitions from one theory to another, as certain theories are either changed or completely abandoned. But nevertheless, the structures persist within over time, and that's what science is investigating.
Yeah, or at the very least, that the structures are the ones that hold priority when in science when we're investigating over time. So instead of, I guess you can think of it in terms of like what is going to be your fundamental concepts or fundamental axioms that you continue on when you move from one old theory to a new theory. In scientific realism or an entity realism, you might focus on saying, well, an electron is always an electron. It has certain properties. How we describe those properties just changes over time. Whereas a structural realist will say, well, the electron's properties might change over time. That's fine. But what doesn't change over time is the fact that the electron exists in the world in a certain way. It interacts with protons, neutrons, or it comes together and forms different elements and that kind of thing. So it's those relationships that are consistent throughout our descriptions of the world, and then how we want to describe them, what names we want to give them, what properties they have, will be dependent on how those relationships manifest themselves.
So it's never just about one theory per se, or one data set or one model. It's always about the sort of structure that we sort of capture and seems to persist. That relationship seems to persist throughout scientific change, right?
Yeah. So it's really about trying to get over Thomas Kuhn's notion of scientific revolutions, where he says that we just completely revolutionize what we think the science is studying, and we shift a paradigm. So we shift from saying that electrons are these balls of things with other stuff circling or that circle these other balls of things. We shift completely to saying no, electrons are energy fields or something like that. That, in Kuhn's view, means that like we kind of got it wrong, maybe, in the history, and whereas structural realism is trying to preserve something between those old theories and that new theory is the structure.
Some kind of truth persists through the scientific change.
Yeah. And it's this structure. I like to think of it as relationships more than structure. This is where the whole physics math part of structural realism comes in. They were very focused on physics, and physics very commonly uses formulas. So for them, it's really easy to see a structure. It's whatever the equation sets out. Because I've been applying it to things that maybe don't use equations when you describe them, I like to think of it more as like preserving relationships that exist.
And so that's how you apply this kind of structuralism to. Obviously, it's not. We're not talking about structures. We're talking about relations. But it's how you apply this kind of framework to biology, right?
Yeah. So, if we're going to say, biological theories have changed over time, did we just get rid of old biological theories when we were talking about how the world interacted with itself? When we were talking about how animals interacted, did we just get rid of all of our old theories and now use our current theories in biology? Theory of evolution, environmental theories, ecological theories about how, the moon affects tides, that kind of thing. If we figured out that those theories were then wrong, would we just get rid of them completely? I don't think that that's what we've done. I think we've preserved something. And what this something has been structures or relationships in the world, in the biological world. So it seems like a good fit, especially because there are so many relationships in the biological world that we constantly talk about.
But there's a bigger issue with talking about these kinds of relations, right? And it has to do with the way we measure.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Sorry, in what way? In terms of like measurements?
Yeah, just in terms of, so part of the issue with this, applying this idea of this relational framework to understanding the persistence of sort of a kind of truth or realism over time. But there's a bigger issue that you sort of have to tackle with, which is the issue of measuring these kinds of high-level relationships compared to the actual data sets and the actual samples we're able to pull from, right?
Right.
I was talking with Phil last time about Nancy Cartwright's How the Laws of Physics Lie.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with Cartwright's work.
But it seems like there's a sort of interesting overlap where it seems like part of the issue that you're talking about in your paper is, when a lot of often high-level theories establish relationships in an abstract way that don't really exist in reality.
Yeah.
So I think one of the examples even that you mentioned in your paper is are like perfect spheres when we're talking about Newton's.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and so the problem is can you find a perfect sphere out in the world? Unlikely. And this causes problems with coming up with abstract theories. It may also be a problem with just how we've come up with science. I don't know. Scientific theories tend to idealize what they're talking about. So, and perhaps that's so that they can come up with these relationships in an ideal world, and then maybe see how consistent they are in the real world, and maybe allow for a little bit of error. Yeah.
So when we're actually trying to measure these things, though, you end up having to use what I think you call mediating models, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes these models aren't always consistent with each
Yeah.
other. And so the structural realist or the relationalist is going to say that the relationship that persists through the mediating models, through the data models, all the way up to a higher level theory, that's what's real.
Yeah. So if you're a structural realist, that's what you're going to say is real. Is they're going to say that there's this underlying kind of framework that we can describe in our high level theory that is used in multiple different mediating models, that is then represented by and then these mediating models explain the different data sets and the different data set models that you come up with in order to and that is what stays consistent. The structural realist will say that that is what is a real relationship in the world. It exists kind of independent of who's observing it, whereas a structural empiricist is probably going to step back from that in terms of the commitment to it being real in the world, and say it's definitely what we can observe. It's definitely a useful tool for making predictions. We've got at least an accurate way to observe things in the world and possibly manipulate things in the world. But whether we're right about how the world actually works, and whether we're mechanistically right about how it's really functioning beyond our observations, we can't commit to. So I've been trying to figure out what that difference is. It's still a little fuzzy in my head between a structural kind of anti-realist and a structural realist, but also then what kind of commitments that makes, especially in a field when it comes to the field of biology.
So again, if I was somebody who wasn't familiar with these issues, why, for example, why is it that I can't directly sort of just confirm a theory, or especially a high level theory like some of the Newtonian theories or even the theory of evolution? Like, why can't I just directly measure that?
Right. So I think part of the problem is that these high-level theories are so complicated. Part of the theory is that they, especially if it's going to be a realist theory, it's going to come down to what can and can't be observed. And it sounds really weird to say that you can observe relationships, but at the same time it doesn't. It seems weird to say that you can measure relationships, even though you can observe them. So how do you kind of come up with this theory that gives you something that can be measured to say, like, okay, I have enough of X to say that this relationship exists? It seems kind of weird, especially in biology when you're talking about things that disappear all the time,
And so it makes it really difficult to talk about. It makes it difficult to sort of say that any one piece of a measured sample or data set directly sort of confirms like the theory of evolution.
Yeah, and there's always this problem of induction, the Humean problem of induction. I don't know if that's come up in any of your previous podcasts, where, if you have a sample, you're always going to be inferring a relationship between your sample and the greater world. Trying to go out there and count all of the sheep in the world might put you to sleep, but it also, is going to be very difficult. Especially if you're considering that you want to, science seems to want to come up with theories that are going to be helpful not only now in the present, but in the future, and also to help you explain some of the stuff in the past. So how do you go out there and count past sheep? Or how do you go out there and, know that you're counting the accurate number of sheep in the future? Well, you can't do that. So this is one of the problems with trying to come up with high-level theories that are going to stay consistent over time.
So so when we're talking about biology, so you want to talk less about structures and more about relationships in biology, right? So can you give an example of what what would count as a real relationship in biology, and how that might show up in a study that might be done on some biological issue?
Right. The one that I can come up with right now, I'm thinking along the lines of the theory of, so the structure or relationship that I want to test is natural selection, and whether that is a relationship that holds in biological communities, in different biological existences, I guess, and whether that works in the real world. And so then you would say, okay, so what does your high level theory say about how natural selection works? It says that over time things will evolve depending on which environment this animal finds itself in, and it will select different properties to make it better for them to survive versus not making it better for them to survive, and those who don't survive are not going to propagate, so those traits will kind of die off in terms of future generations. And then the mediating models, you're like, okay, well, that's kind of a very loose theory, and this can be applied to dogs, cats, birds, plants. There's a lot in the biological world. So what do we want to study? So you would end up with this model in terms of like, okay, so how did dogs work? How does natural selection work in dogs? How does natural selection work in maybe dogs in one house? Or how does natural selection work in dogs that are out in a field? How does natural selection work in fish? And those models might come up with counterpoints. It might be that dogs in the house don't have this kind of adaptation, and it might be an external influence.
So is it the case that part of the issue is that when you talk about these relationships in reality, then that often reality is just so much more messier than the kind of relation, so it's hard to sort of really find clear cut ways to sort of prove these relationships exist in a sort of strictly certain way, right?
Yeah, and so that's what these mediating models are supposed to allow, and what these multiple data models are supposed to allow is that, the world is really complicated and messy. If you're going to study it, you're probably only going to study a part of it, because you just don't have the time or the space to do such a thing, or the resources for that matter. So you're going to have to sample, kind of thing.
So like, as an example of this though, but like if we're talking about like a dog, so if we're talking about like the evolution of dogs in a house, like
I guess it would be more like evolution of dogs in houses, right?
Sure,
you need like multiple data sets.
But I mean, in that case, but if you're comparing it, for example, to the way dogs might develop outside of a house, like in the wild, you're going to find that the way evolution might work was going to be different, because there's also all these different mediating factors that are going to affect the way evolution might work in a house versus in a field, or something else, just because the evolutionary pressures are just going to be very different.
The environment's different. What's considered a good environment for a dog in houses is going to be considered different than what is considered a good, positive environment for dogs that live outside. Yeah.
So you want to move away from the idea of structures to relations, and there was a kind of interesting point where you mentioned that you seem to think that because we're not talking about strict mathematical laws when we're talking about the theory of evolution, that therefore the concept of structure no longer makes sense to use. Why?
Yeah, I think it seemed easier to talk about relationships than to try and change the definition of structure.
So what do we mean when we're talking about a structure?
Yeah, so this is a big question in structural realism. I am not entirely sure that everyone has figured it out. It seems to vary depending on which version of structuralism you look at. But generally, what is pointed to are the mathematical formulas that are used in physics or chemistry or mathematics just in general. Again, it's usually focused on physics. So they say like, well, look, we can transform this formula. We can make Newton's calculations using Einstein's formulas. So look, we found a structure that works. Or a structure that's been preserved. And the structure happens to be the formula. And I went there and I said, okay, so what does this formula actually represent? And I was like, I don't know. Does it represent like a real thing that's floating out there in the world? Or does it actually just represent a relationship? And if it just represents a relationship that's happening, then we could just call it a relationship. And it would make a little bit more sense when you're talking about biological entities. Because you don't really, if you're talking about natural selection, you don't talk about, A plus B equals C, where, dog and environment plus environment equals natural selection. That doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Sure. So if I understand you correctly, it seems like what your position is essentially that whether you're talking about structures or relations, you're still talking about relationships anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're just not you just don't feel the need to call it a structure.
Yeah, and I wanted to allow for kind of this mental widening of the possibility that especially in non-formula or math-laden instances, what you mean by structure could potentially not necessarily be easily crafted into a formula.
Sure.
Or easily crafted into like a thing that you can see.
I appreciate your position on this. So I feel like I might want to push back on the idea that like a structure has to be like you have to reserve the word structure for some law-like formulation.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know. I just don't quite grasp why to be a structure it has to be a law-like relationship. I feel like that concedes too much to people who think that law-like relationships are somehow better or like more certain.
Yeah.
You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
it's possible. I mean, I have been going back to, maybe I should just use structure. That's what everyone's using. It doesn't necessarily imply this law-like structure or law-like relationship. I mean, scaffoldings are structures, and that's not necessarily a law-like explanation of what's going on. So yeah, it could easily be changed. I think it's a work in progress, right? So
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think the thing from my perspective that I find interesting is just how the terms are being used, right?
Mm.
I sometimes I worry about terms being used in certain ways that might concede a little bit of metaphysically just a little bit too much. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think my move to relationships was kind of to like hopefully avoid implying certain metaphysical. I feel like structure has been laden with this metaphysical commitment to formula, but
I
maybe
mean,
not. Maybe
I
not.
mean, relationship seems to. I mean, relationship sounds like a more neutral word, anyways.
Yeah,
You
it's
know what I mean? Like,
and that's why I
it's
moved
not,
to it.
and it isn't like it isn't apt. Like you're
Yeah,
describing a relationship, so it makes sense to call it that.
yeah. I
So,
originally started with relations, and then someone pointed out to me that relations is already being used in logic in a much more strict way, and I was like, oh, that's not what I wanted. I'm gonna have to move away from relations.
yeah, it's always tricky when in philosophy with that kind of thing.
Mhm.
How terms get
Philosophers do like to define terms.
they all like to use their own terms to describe everything that they think is what they're describing.
Yeah, exactly. That's how we make our money. Just making up words.
A giant well, I worry to some degree about incommensurability in philosophy, where you're just like, I don't even know if we're even talking about the same thing anymore.
Yeah.
So for biology, you think that it makes more sense to talk about relationships in biological entities being real. So later on in the paper you sent me, you talk about why especially it becomes important to talk about relations in terms of being able to single out biological individuals or biological entities.
Hmm.
Um, so can you explain a little bit about why that became important and um, how you felt you need to sort of change that framework because of that?
Yeah, so when it comes to biological entities, I was looking into a little bit of the philosophy of biology work on what exactly is an individual in biology. And it seems kind of weird. A lot of this will depend on your views in terms of whether you can define entities based on their chemistry and biochemistry and physical makeup. But for the most part, I was like, okay, so how do I define like an individual dog? And I was like, I could define it by using properties. And I could say a dog has a tail and fur and ears and a tongue and, 4 legs, and a certain internal structure or internal systems. Uh, but that's not always how we define dog. Sometimes dogs have 3 legs instead of 4 legs. Some dogs have tails, some dogs don't have tails. And so I was like, okay, well, if we can't define it based on like just particular properties, maybe we can define it based on what relationship it has to its environment, or what relationship, maybe it's a stable kind of relationship of things that happens, um, and we've just put them all together into what we've classified as dog. And a lot of this comes from the work of John Dupree and Maureen O'Malley. Um, and they kind of have an ontological view where biological entities are stable processes rather than, because you can't individuate biological things. They change over time, but we want to call them the same thing. Uh, so they said like, well, it's less that biological entities have this feature that is immutable through time. And what biological entities actually do is they have processes that create them, and they stay stable over time.
Um, So in the case of biological entities, so you give a good example of this that I think might help illustrate kind of part of what the issue is,
Hmm.
and it has to do with the idea of humans and their gut bacteria, right?
Yeah.
Because our gut bacteria is actually responsible. It can actually be responsible for a lot of like hormonal changes and even some. I think I've read something to the effect that it can even perform cognitive work, or at
Yeah.
least
It
it has a
was.
role in cognitive tasks. And so you know your gut bacteria sort of to some extent kind of determines who you are,
Yeah.
right? What you believe and how you behave and those kinds of things. And so are you distinct from your gut bacteria? When we talk about you being human, does that include your gut bacteria or not?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And so and so that's a really tricky thing when you're trying to find and pick out specific organisms, right?
Yeah. And then if your gut bacteria, changes a little bit over time, say what your gut bacteria was as a kid is different from what your gut bacteria is when you're older, an adult. So, maybe you could eat apples when you were a kid, and now as an adult, for some reason, your gut bacteria are like, no more apples. Does that make you a different person?
Are you the same entity?
Yeah. Right. And I think a lot of people would be like, yeah. Or whether I can eat apples or not doesn't change who I am. Um,
I came across another example that I think is actually kind of neat. I don't know if you're all that familiar with it. Are you familiar with canine transmissible venereal tumors?
I am not familiar with them.
So it's a kind of illness that dogs have, where they basically get a form of cancer through sexual transmission, right?
Oh,
But the
that's
interesting
unfortunate.
it really is, but it's much more weird than that. The cancer in this case is actually a piece. It's a tumor. It's a piece of a dog that may have lived 11,000 years ago, and basically it's a tumor that figured out a way to transmit itself sexually and then essentially clone itself.
Wow, okay.
And so this disease that dogs, thousands of dogs have even to this day, they have a piece of this tumor which
Yeah.
contains this original dog's DNA.
Wow, okay.
So,
Yeah.
when you're talking about this kind of condition, right?
Hmm.
Is it a kind of cancer? Is it a dog? Is it a virus?
Yeah.
Is it a breed of dog?
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
this living cancer? Is it just its own unique thing at this point? Is it still a dog at all?
Yeah, exactly, right? Like originally it was part of a dog, so do we have to keep it there because it had the properties of a dog back then?
It's not just. I mean, the DNA literally. It's just a tumor that
Yeah.
contains. It's a piece of the dog, right?
I
So
mean,
it's
yeah,
like,
so, I guess if you're looking at it from a DNA standpoint, then you'd have to be like, yeah, I guess it is the same DNA dog. That sounds weird. Yeah, so this is why I was like, oh, maybe we need to step away from, like, having the same DNA makes you the same thing. Also because, like, 98% of our genome is shared with other animals or something like that, so...
so it seems so. But I mean, all this fits into the point that you are making, which is that it's not just enough to talk about relations. They have to be relevant relations to some purpose that we have established, right?
Right.
Like in the case of the CTBT, like whether you want to call it a pathogen or if you want to call it a dog or a kind of dog, or you want to just call it, I mean, a lot of that will depend on not metaphysics but your goals, right? Like how do
Yeah,
you want to treat this thing, right? How do you want to understand it as a kind of thing it is, right?
right. Yeah.
So that leads you to another step with the structural realism, which is a form of eliminativism, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is borrowed from Stephen French. I'm actually backtracking on that a little bit recently. whether we can actually eliminate. So in eliminativism, in Stephen French's version of structuralism, he wants to say that the world is just made of structures. That's it. All the way down to the base of our physics, it's just structures, relationships that happen. So, you know, what makes up our macro stuff are just these structures, these real patterns, I guess you could say. And I didn't mind that idea, mostly because of this, you know, how do you explain what this cancer is? Well, you know, it's a combination of DNA. Okay, so what's a combination of DNA? Well, it's a relationship between amino acids. Okay, what's an amino acid? And then you start getting into chemistry. And then once you get into chemistry, you know, you kind of can somewhat get into physics. And then I realized that this is a fairly reductive view. And I wasn't sure how comfortable I was with that. But at the same time, it makes sense. And so, yeah, because like still... every day we talk about, you know, what your DNA is. So
you're not fully decided on where you want to stand on the issue of...
Yeah, I'm not fully decided on where I want to stand. I have been looking into Daniel Dennett's work on real patterns. And I believe his paper is actually called Real Patterns. And Dennett argues that these real patterns kind of emerge out of an underlying framework. And it doesn't matter what this underlying substrate framework is. The pattern that emerges is real. And we can call it something. And we can give it, you know, the name of an object. We can call it an object or a pattern or something like that. And so I've been kind of toying with this idea also of like, well, maybe we do have real biological objects. We don't have to eliminate objects and say there's only patterns all the way down. We don't have to say that it's only stable processes all the way down. Maybe we can say that there are biological objects, but what's really important, or maybe what's just as important, is the relationships. And what defines these objects partially is what relationship that object has to what we're studying or what environment it's found in.
I mean, it's a bit, it's a bit striking for French's position, right? To sort of say that, like, in terms of, the relations are real, but not objects, and especially not biological objects, or at least biological entities, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
especially in biology, you're like, well, I'm pretty sure I can see my dog.
Yeah, I mean, but it's not just that though, because I mean, it's sort of it kind of reads a bit Platonist, right? You sort of end up with a kind of account where you want to say that the real the things that really exist are like forms, right? They're like these sort of abstract relationships that exist in the world, but not the everyday stuff that we see and feel and touch.
Yeah. Yeah, which is kind of weird to think about.
It's a bit odd, yeah.
It's very odd. It's also weird to think about, like, okay, so if you are French, then you have to explain how you have relationships without things to relate them.
Yeah, I was wondering that myself.
Yeah, right.
So how can there be a relationship if you want to say that the things that are related don't exist?
Yeah.
What the hell?
And I mean, like, French kind of gets out of it by saying, oh, well, you just keep going down a level. But I'm like, yeah, well, then, you know, where does this bottom out?
Yeah.
So, I've been looking a little bit into kind of like the quantum mechanics stuff. And I mean, they can describe the relationships right now. They can't necessarily describe the properties. I think part of the problem in quantum mechanics is that the two things that end up getting related have exactly the same properties, which would make them not individuals, right? According to the principle of identity of individuals, if you want to keep that in there.
Yeah.
But for some reason, they end up on either side of this relation. And so you're like, okay, so it is different, but it's not different at the same time. And so that's where they get into this problem.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, if you want to be a pragmatist about it, you can kind of square that circle pretty easily. But if you want to say that if you want to say that no, the structures or the relationships of the stuff that is is really real, right? Then you kind of have a bigger issue there.
Yeah, which is also why I've been toying with this idea of like, well, maybe we should just kind of stop at what we can observe.
In terms of like, what do you mean?
In terms of like kind of Ron von Frassen's notion of like observables are what we study. We can be committed to like our empirical accuracy about observables, but that is kind of it because we are observing humans. So maybe that's all we can do. And talking about the real world versus the not real world, well, that's just like kind of.
It sounds a bit like your metaphysics is a little up in the air, or at least a little more. You're reserving judgment, I guess, for a while.
I am, yes. Partially because of my project.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'd be the last person to tell anybody that they should commit to a metaphysics to start.
Yeah. But partly also because I want to do a naturalized kind of science and a naturalized philosophy where I rely on what the science tells me to kind of direct where my metaphysics goes.
So would it be fair then to say that you're committed to a kind of scientism?
Yeah, probably. I don't know if scientificism is different than naturalism, but yeah, I mean, naturalistic philosophy. So really basing it on science.
So I mean, I tend to be, I'm fairly committed to naturalistic philosophy as well, but not to, and I'm committed to the idea that we learn through the scientific method, understood broadly. But I wouldn't be committed to the idea that like science is the sort of that especially in terms of the institutionalized sciences, that they are the sort of final arbiters of what is actually really real.
Yeah, I think it's I'm probably on the same wavelength as you are with respect to this. I think that the science can inform what is more likely to be real, and then in terms of what is really real, I think that's a philosophical question. And I think that is partially why philosophers and scientists should talk a lot and often and frequently, because I think that these two things interact.
Oh well, yeah. I mean, I think there's a big issue with and of course it always depends on the science field itself too, right? Because I think you'll find that physicists probably have a different kind of implicit metaphysics than the biologist does.
Yeah, I've been working on trying to figure out if that's true, and if they do have different metaphysics, which has been an interesting kind of progress. thankfully, the University of Waterloo has the Perimeter Institute, and the physicists there, the theoretical physicists there, do a lot of philosophy of physics as well as whatever it is they study. It's beyond me. Just looks like a bunch of numbers and letters and Greek letters scribbled on a wall. And so my current project is actually to kind of like go into a biology lab and see what the biologists are saying. Whether I'm actually going to get a picture of what their metaphysics is a different story.
Well, it's such a tricky it's a tricky thing that you can't just say to somebody out of the blue, "Hey, tell me your metaphysics," right?
Yeah, exactly. And I also don't know if their metaphysics changes in lab versus out of lab.
Yeah. Or whether they might be consciously committed to one metaphysics, but their work is actually more kind of committed to another form of metaphysics.
Yeah. So I have been taking this kind of embedded philosophy approach where I, go and observe in a lab, which is part of the reason why I'm in the applied philosophy stream at University of Waterloo. And so I've embedded myself in this lab in order to kind of like observe what they do and to see if there's kind of hints in what they talk about and how they talk about their work that will point me towards what their metaphysics is. And then maybe, be able to have these kind of discussions or do some reading based on what other people have talked to these biologists about what biological entities are, what they think they are, how they treat them, that kind of thing.
So have you been in these you've been in these labs and you've been doing these observations?
Yeah, so most of my work has been informal, just kind of, hey, do you want to chat with me a little bit about what you do? But as part of my current applied research project, I actually got ethics approval to go into a lab and do this kind of observation. So that's just starting. I don't have, and I probably can't really talk about the observations yet, but...
Sounds fascinating.
It is,
I'd be excited for that.
Hopefully. We'll see. I might come out of it being like, they have no idea.
Yeah.
Kind of completely, I have no idea. They, we're talking about all their formulas the whole time. So yeah, it will be interesting to see if we can come up with this. But I have the suspicion that there's some like kind of tacit knowledge that you can pick up just by being as in a lab as I can be during COVID.
So
unfortunately, it's one person in the lab at a time. So
yeah, I can imagine a project like that being so tricky because on the one hand, you want to sort of be able to keep up and sort of understand and really make the most of the opportunity, but if you're not fully following everything that's happening, it might be a bit more tricky.
I didn't realize how much like program work I would need to understand. So they use a lot of programs to sort through their data.
Yeah.
And I mean, back when I was, in ancient days when I did science in my undergrad, my data
didn't have computers back then.
No, we didn't have downloadable databases. We might have had a few things. I vaguely remember doing making some systematic charts, defining evolutionary trees based on data on a computer. But now they go through all sorts of things, weather patterns and, species migration and all of these other things and who's what, where, when, why, how. They, have gotten all this new technology that they can track these things, which has increased the amount of data they get to work with. But at the same time, it's, meant that they need to use these computer programs that I now need to learn to
Sometimes
understand what they're saying. Maybe.
it can require a lot of sort of programming knowledge, and
Yeah.
it's a tricky. It's interesting noting how, like, the work of science changes over time. So you mentioned that you're doing an embedded philosophy approach, where you're actually observing scientists in a lab. So how did you arrange to do something like that, and what's that going to entail for you?
Yeah, so it was a very interesting and like new process for me. I've never done something like that. It's slightly unusual for philosophers to go out into the field, as they say. And so luckily at the University of Waterloo, we have someone who has done similar activities, not quite exactly the same. She wasn't embedded in a lab, but she has had a lot of interactions and collaborations with scientists. So I asked her, I went to have a meeting with her, and I said, look, I understand that you do a lot of collaborative work, and you're interested in this. And I was kind of like, would you be interested in this project that I'm working on, which is to take what you have written in your paper, so this is Dr. Catherine Plaisance, and enact it, so to speak. So kind of do this socially relevant philosophy of science, make sure that what I'm talking about is relevant to the science, it's current to the science. And she was on board, so that made it a lot easier. And she said, yeah, this will be a lot of fun, this will be great. And we started sifting together how we would go about doing it. Looking through texts, it turns out that there is a book that came in very helpful called A Guide to Field Philosophy. And that one helped us kind of get an idea of like what would be involved in terms of networking into a lab, what would be involved, like how some other people have done their embedded work. Some people have gone into labs, some people have just collaborated, some people have done field philosophy just by, doing interviews or something like that. So we took their advice. Some of it we thought would work, some of it we didn't think would work with this particular project. And we had my supervisor reached out to potential labs to see if someone was interested. And it turns out there were some scientists who were interested in talking to philosophers, which was great. And someone who was open to having a philosopher in their lab. And so that's how the whole thing ended up getting started. Really was me just coming up with an idea, finding a bunch of people who were on board with this idea, and then sorting out the details later.
So you just sort of make an agreement that you're going to be conducting these kind of interviews?
Right. Yeah, so part of being embedded in the lab is I wanted to maybe less discuss stuff with the with the scientists, because sometimes you don't always know what your philosophical views are, and it takes a lot of discussion, or it just takes observation and someone else kind of taking an outsider view in to be like, I think maybe you're approaching it this way, or I think maybe you're approaching it that way. So what we did was we decided to just do the observation part for my current project because it was so short. Whereas interviews would probably take a lot longer to set up, and I didn't have that kind of time frame. And as we were going through this, we were like, wait, we're working with like people. That probably requires an ethics review of some sort. And we weren't entirely sure if it would count, because really I'm just observing people, but it is a closed lab, so I need permission to be there. But once I have permission, do I need any other further permissions? We weren't sure. Thankfully, the University of Waterloo Research Ethics Board is very open to answering those kinds of questions. So you just send them off an email, and they're like, okay, what's the gist of your project? And you explain it to them, and they'll tell you right away, yes, you need ethics clearance for that. No, you don't need ethics clearance for it. This is the type of ethics clearance you're going to be looking for. And yeah, they were actually extremely helpful in going through how to get started, at least. So it turns out that I did need ethics clearance. because I would be observing people, potentially quoting them, even if it's anonymous, even if you're just attributing lab member said this, you still need to get clearance at least to know your boundaries and to know their boundaries and to kind of get an idea of what is confidential, what isn't, what's private, what isn't. So yeah, we ended up going to the research ethics clearance rather than just putting a survey out in the world and hoping that scientists would answer it, or just, popping my head in and viewing people without them knowing, kind of thing. Which is that odd two-way street of you want them to act normal in the lab, but they know that they're being observed, so they're probably not going to act completely normal. But at the same time, you also want them to know that they're being observed so that it's not infringing on any of their privacy rights or anything like that.
Sure. I mean, and it seems like it would be important. I mean, sometimes even just the ability to, I mean, a scientist might say they're doing one thing and they might have their own sort of account on it, but that's not necessarily what everybody might think if they were just watching them.
Yeah.
Like
exactly.
the philosopher might have a different take on what the scientist is doing than what the scientist might report themselves.
Right. Yeah. Or, a philosopher could maybe even come in and be like highlighting some of this stuff like that. To be like, do you know why you do this? Do you know if it's important? Is it important? And then maybe that'll help, clarify some of those processes that they're doing too. So it could be even helpful for philosophers to be doing this.
So, I mean, the thing is that obviously, like you said, you're just interviewing people or observing them, and there are some boundary issues, but, not high level ethical concerns, I imagine. But I mean, the fact that you had to go through that process sounds like, even that would have a lot of insight, just because, it's the same kind of process that scientists themselves have to go through when they, when they're proposing research that might have ethical boundaries, right?
Yeah, it was actually a really interesting process to go through. It was a very difficult process to go through. You have to be very specific about what you're doing. You have to kind of, I don't know if this is a flaw in their system or not. That's up to someone who looks into research ethics. But they're very committed to understanding like the boundaries of what you're asking and what you're observing and how you're doing it, mostly out of this concern for your subjects, which is great. But at the same time, when you're doing something like philosophy, you maybe don't want to have an extremely clear idea of the answers or the process or the types of things that you're going to be looking for, because that might cloud or bias you towards a particular perspective. So it was very interesting for me to try and figure out, how do I explain my process of philosophically analyzing what's going on in a way that gives a clear indication of what I'm looking for, but at the same time doesn't bias me into expecting particular observations to show up.
Yeah, I mean, especially in early research stages in philosophy, it's, you just come on and be like, well, I'm not really sure what I'm looking for, but I'll know it when I see it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's always a lot of like, I think I'm looking for this. I don't know, maybe there's like 5 different options or 5,000 different options. We'll see which one pans out. And you kind of sit there and you're like, does the research ethics board need to know all 5,000 different options? Probably not. So it came down a lot more to what types of questions I was going to be asking, or what types of observations I would specifically be looking for. Am I looking for specific statements coming out of people's mouths, or am I just looking for mannerisms, or am I looking for keywords or something like that? And that helped them kind of say like, oh, okay, so she's not, necessarily going to go in there and be like poking people to see how they react or something like that. Or she's not going to say, really weird things to see how they react necessarily. She's going to be just kind of looking to see how do they talk to each other about particular topics. for example, species or environment or model or something like that. These are the concepts that philosophers are interested in. So then when they said, well, what kind of observations are you looking for? I can just answer, well, I'm looking to see if they explain what model they're using, or I'm looking to see if they don't explain it. If they don't, why don't they explain it? Is it just assumed that everybody knows it? Is it because they have it written down somewhere and everyone's like, okay, you just use this model? Those are the more philosophical stuff. And so then it also helped me clarify exactly what I was going to be doing, which is great. Yeah, and a little bit more about like what my topic and thesis would be. So that was helpful too.
Yeah, I can imagine, because it just naturally you have to start getting more specific about these things. Although to some degree too, I feel like philosophy usually is a bit more free to kind of pivot. You know,
Yeah.
we find something new while we're observing, and then suddenly we're like, oh, that's really interesting. I want to look at that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it turns out that the Research Ethics Board is okay with you doing that. So we were talking about that.
As long as they sort of roughly know the parameters. Like,
Yeah. And they have a process in place where if you do end up pivoting, or if you do end up saying like,
yeah,
I started off just doing observations, it turns out I'm actually going to have to start doing semi-structured interviews, or I'm going to have to start asking questions, a lot of very specific questions, then you can amend your current review to say like, okay, I've been there for 3 weeks. It turns out I'm going to need to do a different approach. This is the new approach. These are the questions I'm going to be asking. Is this okay? And then they come back and they said that the turnaround time for amendments has been usually very quick because they already know the basic structure of what you're doing. So they're just looking for those added details. So yeah, it was a pleasant and unpleasant experience all at the same time. Slightly stressful because you're sitting there like, I need this before I can even talk to the lab members. If you're on a deadline for finishing a project like I am, it's like, oh goodness. So when they tell you to do research ethics clearance really far in advance, they're not kidding.
Yeah.
You did ask about the connection between science, and I think it was really interesting too, to see that like this is the kind of stuff that the scientists have to go through. These are the kinds of restrictions that scientists are under, which I think a lot of people don't respect. There are certain things they can test, there are certain things they can't test, and so if you're questioning research results because they couldn't test something, or they didn't test something, maybe part of it is this process. So that's also something that should be considered, which I don't think we, unless you've gone through it, you don't really consider those sorts of things. So it's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, anything just give you additional insight, as opposed to just being. You don't want to be the philosopher who talks about scientists and never experiences what it's like to be a scientist at all, right?
Yeah.
So I'm still kind of interested then. So, where would you? So I kind of two related questions in my mind. So, one is if we're going to talk about relations being like the really real things, right? Does that mean like within the scope of your sort of account? Does this just apply within biology, or does this should apply across the board to any kind of knowledge claim? And
good question. I'm not sure if it will apply to any kind of knowledge claim. It might. I was definitely thinking it would apply to any kind of scientific knowledge claim.
So does that commit you to, or does that commit not necessarily you, but any potential structural realist or structural relationalist or does that commit them to like to a much larger ontology beyond just science? Are we saying that buses and computers and those things don't exist either, but the relationships that allow them to work do?
It could. It could, and if I really kind of thought about it, I'd almost have to say, like, wait a second, okay, so what's a bus? Well, it's, this metal thing that, people sit on. Okay, well, it's only a metal thing that people sit on. Like, is it
if
a
a bus
bus?
has no if a bus has no gas, is it still a bus?
Yeah, exactly. Or, all those buses that no longer function. Are they still buses? What about the buses that get turned into like campers or something like that? Are they still buses? Maybe, maybe not. But they definitely are buses when they are in relationships where they're considered buses.
So what kind of metaphysics do you? I know that you feel like you're maybe in a position where you're not necessarily leaning heavily on one side or the other right now, but
Yeah.
But in terms of your own sort of metaphysics and when you talk about some sort of commitment to realism, what do you mean by those terms?
To me, a commitment to realism means that there is a world that is unaffected by the humans that move through it, and how I see it. That there are things out there that are interacting, and they will interact whether I'm here or not. If the tree will still fall down in the forest, whether I watch it fall, hear it fall, or not.
But does the tree exist?
Yeah, I a realist would say yeah, because it fell. But I don't know. This is the unfortunate part of philosophy. I always end up coming back to, like, I could be wrong. I could be wrong about all of this. I could just be a brain in a vat. I could just be living in the Matrix, and it's all just... It doesn't exist. Independent of myself, I guess.
Never ceasing quest for certainty.
Yeah. Although, now that I think about it, I'm like, if I'm a brain in a vat, then, like, how does the brain exist if I need to, be aware of what I am to, like, then that would still be a realism, because you would still have to be a brain in a vat. There would still have to be a vat independent of my brain. Is
the gut bacteria in the vat too?
Yeah, I don't know.
It might have to be. I don't know.
I guess it would have to be. Maybe not. Because I could just be making it up that I have gut bacteria.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe the bacteria doesn't exist either.
Yeah. Sometimes I, like, kind of wish that it was immutable, because then I could, pretend I had $1 million, and then maybe I would.
You could...
Or we live in a world where philosophers are paid lots of money, like doctors. That would be a nice world.
Maybe. Depends on the philosopher, maybe.
Yeah. Would a philosopher still be a philosopher if they got paid lots of money?
Oh, I don't know. It's hard to say. They'd be too busy riding around in their Lamborghinis, maybe.
Yeah.
Does this Lamborghini exist? It does for me.
I don't know. Sure does now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'd probably find a lot more egoist philosophers if they made as much money.
Yeah. Be interesting for moral philosophy, that's for sure.
So would you still want to find that kind of, like, realism, or do you think that you'd be more comfortable with a kind of anti-realism? Because the kind of interesting thing that you end up with in your paper is you talk about the importance of relevance, right? Relevant relationships. But if you're talking about relevant relationships, I was sort of wondering, is that still mind independent enough if the kind of relationships depend, and what we're identifying as a relationship depends on us?
Yep. I think I end up being maybe a pluralist of sorts, in terms of I might end up on the anti-realist side, if I'm being honest. Mostly just because I'm not entirely sure how I would observe a real mind-independent world, because I have a mind. I'm like, that
Sure.
doesn't make sense. Like, how would I know that I'm right? Because my perspective would always be interfering. But yeah, I've been toying with the idea of maybe we can be pluralists about it. But I'm not entirely sure. You know, could we be realists about DNA, physics, but more on the anti-realist side when it comes to like relevant relations between dogs and cats and environments? Maybe, maybe not.
Do you think there's an issue or a problem with kind of committing yourself to what real means in different contexts like that? Like if I say, you know, within biology by real I mean this, and in physics by real I mean that, and in the everyday world by real I mean this. Like, do you see that as being problematic, or do you think that if we're going to talk about real, a kind of realism, that it should apply to every kind of claim?
I think it could be problematic. I think it could definitely lead to you know, if you're saying something's not real in one circumstance but then real in another, that sounds very inconsistent. So I hesitate. But yeah,
you're still not fully committed in terms of what kind of metaphysics you ultimately want to subscribe to.
This is why I
guess
hate doing metaphysics.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that I like turned out to be doing metaphysics, I hated doing it the whole time because I was like, but I can never be sure, and this really sucks. And I keep coming up with all of these walls and barriers and what ifs. I don't know if that makes me like a real philosopher or not, but I keep coming up with these what ifs to everything that I come up with, especially when it comes to metaphysics. You know, maybe I need to move back into the realm of epistemology where I can just determine what I know, and that's good enough.
It's kind of interesting because you know, I was talking about your work with my partner who used to study economics, right?
Yeah.
And one of the common complaints that her and I have had with economics, I'm sure a lot of other people do too, is that you know, economics tends to lean heavily on this idea of like invariant laws and trying to sort of make sure all their models sort of reflect these kind of invariant laws, despite what, you know, actual experience might be showing them, right?
Yeah.
So in some sense, the you know, the economist wants to be a structural realist in some respects, right? That's what they want to say is the real thing that exists out there, and, you know, are these sort of invariant relationships that exist. And but I worry as you know, and I'm wondering if you might potentially have a worry too, where just in terms of the sort of logistics of inquiry over time, that this might lead to a kind of scientific community that's less likely to want to revise their view of what are real structures. You know what I mean? Do you see that as being a potential worry, where when you start saying things like the actual objects I'm interacting with don't really exist, but some invariant relationship that I think exists does exist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be a problem. I want to say it could be a problem, especially for a structural realist, which is why I haven't completely committed to the realism part of it. Although, and I am really grateful to James Ladyman for talking this morning with me about it. Ladyman explained that, like, in structural realism, it's more about modality. Structural realism is based on this notion of modal structure, where it preserves particular statements of necessity and possibility. So what is necessary and what is possible happens, defines what structures are available. So it does commit to a certain modality of the universe, especially if you're a realist. But I don't think that's quite that far-fetched because, you know, as far as we know, there does seem to be these kind of weird laws in the world. You know, there's the thing that, like, humans can't fly on their own seems to be part of this modality of human beings.
It simply isn't part of the structure of the world that we can sort of engage in flight by ourselves.
Exactly, right? And so I think that is probably the, like, limit of the structures that would be allowed to continue, if that makes any sense. Is that, like, you can commit to structures, but you can only commit to, like, this modal structure. So you have to kind of define the possibilities and the necessities.
It almost sounds that we're simply talking about completely abstract possible relationships, though.
Yeah, it does.
Again, it really pushes into that sort of Plato territory of.
It does, yeah. And I challenged Ladyman a little bit on this, and I said, well, doesn't your version of, like, modal necessity and possibility depend on? And he said, well, it depends on what science says is possible. And I was like, but that, and necessary, and I was like, but that just assumes a realism. Like, it just assumes that you're right. Like, that sounds like a very interesting circle you've got going on there.
Yeah.
And as we know, circles are not the best if you're starting out with the theory, a philosophical theory. So I was like, it seems like you're kind of just assuming that the world is real, and that it has particular possibilities and necessities, and that is the structure that's going to keep going. Which is why I end up questioning this kind of realism part of it. I have a feeling it comes down to, okay, so how do we know it's real? The age-old argument, the no miracles argument, for anyone who has studied realism and anti-realism, it really just comes down to, well, it would be a miracle if we were getting all of this stuff accurate and it not be right. So, we're probably right.
I mean, this kind of speaks to a question I had too about, you know, particularly when we're talking about, because you kind of talk about this a little bit yourself, which is, you know, especially when you're talking about incompatible or conflicting mediating models, then how do you know that you're still talking about the same structure?
Exactly. Yeah. It is a problem. And as my paper points out, you know, Catherine Brading has brought forth this problem. Science does seem to come up with these conflicting models, and we haven't yet figured out how to reconcile them. What does that mean for realism? It's probably not good news.
Do you think maybe it's time to think about realism in perhaps a different way?
Perhaps.
Like it's funny because, like, part of the issue I have with the whole realist and anti-realist camp is that I don't like anti-realists sort of define themselves completely within the scope of what they play the sort of game by the realists' standards, right?
They definitely do. They're just not realists. Yeah.
You know, William James had this interesting line. He was sort of defending realism, and he says, he's like, I'll call myself a realist if you let me say what I mean by realism, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think it's an important question to ask whether, our definitions of realism and anti-realism really are accurate, maybe necessary. Are the lines maybe a little bit more blurred? When I talk to scientists about it, it's kind of this weird thing where like they don't care.
Yeah.
Where they don't care if they're actually studying the real world, or whether they're actually or whether they're just making really good observations, because what they do works. So maybe that's what we need to talk about in terms of what's real and what isn't. Yeah.
Well, I find it so funny. Like I honestly love hearing stuff like that, because it's like, what is the philosopher fighting for? You know what I mean? If they want to defend the science and say the science is discovering reality, but even the scientists don't go that far and wouldn't say, so why hold such a high view of science if even the scientists, by their own sort of approach and standards, say this isn't a question we're investigating?
Yeah, exactly right. Which I had a little bit of a conversation about the other day. I was like, so why do we hold like science in such high esteem? And then, and we actually ended up on this topic of whether science has to have like this kind of outer public face, and like kind of this like internal private face, where like internally they know that they are never 100% sure of their conclusions. They're aware of the Hume's inference problem, but on this public view, because science gets used to build bridges and create vaccines and stuff like that, they want to be confident. Also partially for funding, like the people that are confident in their science get funding. The people who are like, I might be right, I might not be right, do you want to give me $1 million to figure it out?
Yeah.
Not a lot of people are going to do that.
I mean, there's been so many issues over the last year where you see, examples where society sort of, or at least the public, kind of struggles a little bit with understanding what the scientists are up to and why they're saying the kind of things they're saying.
Yeah.
Like even in the early days of COVID, right? It's interesting because COVID-19, the term describes the illness, right? Not the virus.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of what the virus causes as an illness, like it varies so widely, right? Like to some people it's completely asymptomatic, to other people like they'll have very severe symptoms, and other people and some symptoms we find people get sick and then they'll come up with symptoms and they say, well, is this a symptom of COVID-19? Is it not? And so what processes sort of guide and govern those kinds of decisions? And it's very rarely a purely empirical, like, this is just what actually is happening out there, right?
Yeah.
And so much of this tends to get lost on the public, and so you end up with confusion and sort of paranoia that kind of sets in, and they go, well, now they're changing their mind about this, and they weren't saying this before.
Did your masks not work? I don't know. Yeah. So and I mean, a part of it too is just like, I think that a lot of people want really simple answers. They want this like, yes, no. Does a mask work? Yes or no? And that's going to tell me whether I should work. Whether I should wear it or not. And the actual answer is, it kind of works. It's kind of doesn't. It really depends, and it's complicated. Yeah. Are you in a relationship? Are you not in a relationship? Well, it's complicated. No.
What is a relationship?
It depends on how you define it, right? So
people are like, not only am I in a relationship, but I don't even exist.
Exactly. It's impressive. I'm somehow in a relationship, but I don't exist.
Going back to what you originally sort of prompted the sort of issue of values in science, has this changed your view in terms of any of this kind of all this discussion, this research into structuralism and that kind of stuff, has it affected your views on, or changed your perspective on the relationship between values and science?
Not really. It's kind of more solidified my views, if anything. I am definitely in agreement with a lot of some of the feminist views, or feminist philosophy of science, though I don't like the term feminist philosophy of science for other reasons, but because they've brought in a whole bunch of other criticisms from other areas, so it's not really feminist anymore. But it has kind of more just solidified that, scientists have particular values, and what makes a scientist a good scientist or a bad scientist seems to have a lot to do with what their values are, versus what they do, if that makes, or what procedure they follow.
Interesting.
Yeah, so because it seems like there's certain things that scientists value, but I don't know, maybe.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say the two are disconnected, right? Because obviously, if your values are going to drive what you do, right? They're going to drive your methods and the kinds of protocols and stuff that you might end up using.
Yeah, I should also clarify. My view of values too is not just kind of moral, ethical values influencing science. It's also epistemic values. I guess it would be the difference between Heather Douglas, I believe, brought up the difference between epistemic values and non-epistemic values. So for me, I do see stuff like empirical accuracy, transparency, fruitfulness. Those are values in my mind that scientists hold.
Sure.
Right? And so whether, and those could be different from, whether they value, I don't know,
feminist,
the greater good or something like that.
Sure, yeah.
And so whether their moral value of the greater good influences their science is a different statement than saying them valuing empirical accuracy influences their science.
Sure.
But I definitely, it's very much, the more that I research into these things, the more that I think there are certain values that scientists hold in order to kind of explain that their science is good or not pseudoscience, if
sure,
you want to demarcate, in order to demarcate what they think is science versus not science.
So all this research that you've been doing has been originally driven by this idea of discussing values in science and trying to understand what it is that science is actually doing. Where do you think you might like to take your research in the future?
Yeah. I mean, I have been thinking a little bit about this since I need to come up with a prospectus and a project and write a dissertation before my funding runs out. I think I would really like to kind of explore a little bit about maybe keep going with what my current project is. See if I can actually come up with this applicable structural theory, answer some of those questions in terms of, where I kind of stand on the realism, empiricism train, but maybe more so even where scientists land on this train, kind of get more data in terms of what scientists' perspectives are, if they think about these things, if it's not something that they think about or worry about, and maybe do a little more of a qualitative or quantitative kind of research into that, but always with this background notion in mind that there might be some values that are interacting, and maybe be able to discuss that with some of some of the scientists, and to kind of see like what they think about values, and how they affect their metaphysical commitments, their epistemological commitments, if they do, if they don't, if they think it's not an issue, is probably where I would head.
So do you think that, so is your research, do you think it's more for philosophers, for scientists, or for everyone else?
I think it'll be, I'm hoping that it will be for both philosophers and scientists. I think other people will be interested in it. I might have to explain it in different terms. There's a lot of technical terms that I'm going through. So if like maybe the general public was interested in these kind of ideas, I've been kind of toying with this question about like why biologists should care about metaphysics. And so maybe kind of writing about that. But I do think that there's a role to play for philosophy, and metaphysics and epistemology and ethics in science, that could help them in some way, maybe expand their research, make it more robust, make it, I don't know, less biased if they think that that's a problem. So I really think that there's a role that philosophy can play in terms of helping them kind of piece through what's happening. And I don't want that to be an additional requirement for scientists. So I thought, hey, maybe philosophers of science can do that for them if they interact enough with them.
Do you so do you think that more philosophers of science should be looking to these kinds of laboratory, like specific hands-on kind of laboratory type studies, or?
I think it really depends on like what exactly your goals of your philosophy of science are. Some of it might be doable without doing this kind of hands-on laboratory stuff, but I think if you're going to start making statements about what scientists think, about what scientists' goals are, about what kind of values scientists have, or what kind of paradigms they work in, then maybe you should ask them. They probably know at least a little bit about it, or at the very least, like observe and figure it out for yourself. Not just use your own intuitions, or just what you read. I think basing your philosophy of science just on published works or your intuitions might miss some really important details about the scientific process, that don't end up in these papers.
Yeah, I mean it's funny because even if you're committed to whatever kind of realism, I mean the funny thing is like even the kinds of like close interaction and study and sometimes discussion and kinds of those kinds of interactions that you might have with actual scientists, you may not necessarily come in and sort of say, well, you're doing it wrong or something like that, but you might notice issues or examples or cases that are relevant in ways that the scientists may not see that you might, right? And so it's always good to have additional pairs of eyes on these kinds of things to try to make these kinds of accounts of what the scientist thinks that they're doing and what the philosopher thinks that the scientist is doing are a little less idiosyncratic to each,
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, I'm hoping that there maybe sometimes if you get issues with like communication, maybe that can be clarified by a philosopher who comes in and says, well, I understand what you're saying and I understand what this other person's saying. So there is some overlap there. Maybe you guys are just, talking about different things in different ways or the same thing in different ways. And those kind of conceptual thinking about things and discussions, I don't know if that's, necessarily a good use of the scientist's time. Do you think it's important? So when we're
do you think it matters who or which scientists that we're talking to? Like, do you think that there's a reason why we should look to one kind of science, or do you think there's as much value in talking, for example, to the biologist in their lab as it might be to talk to a sociologist in theirs?
I definitely think that we shouldn't just be focusing on one particular science. I think we should be talking to all of them. I think we should be considering maybe even the possibility that people are doing science that we don't call scientists. There might be other cultures out there that do things in a different way, but end up coming up with similar conclusions, or maybe they describe what they're doing, describe their process in a different way, but actually end up doing the same kind of analysis that what we have come to know as like Western science process or the scientific method.
Is there what do you think? Like, what is it that you think makes a scientist a scientist? I'm thinking of an example from that John Dewey provides. He gives an example of like a farmer repairing his tractor, right? And he says if the farmer takes an experimental and systematic approach, if they're following a sort of scientific method, they're engaging in science.
Mm-hmm.
Would you go that far, or are you going to say no? The science, like, there's something more to science than just following a kind of experimental methodology.
I think I would probably go a little bit farther than just saying like it's a particular methodology. I do think methodology is a large part of it. It might be because, I think that maybe some of the goals also influence whether a science becomes a science or not. I think maybe some of the like standards for what becomes acceptable or not.
Is it more communal, do you think? Does it require a community?
I definitely tend towards the Helen Longino communal view of science. I do like Longino's perspective on what makes scientific knowledge, and that it is quite communal. It's public. It's open to criticism. I'm still working on. I mean, I haven't solved the demarcation problem by any means between what is considered science and what is not considered science. But I want to be open to the possibility that people who describe what they do in different terms may actually be doing something that's scientific, even if it's not super familiar to us. Yeah, maybe it is possible that if a farmer, does stuff in a systematic and particular way with the hopes of, creating a new crop that's more efficient and something like that, maybe that is doing science. Because I'm not entirely sure how different that is from what a scientist does in a lab.
I mean, if
their experiments might not have as many controlled variables, but maybe it does. I don't know.
And it's not, and their conclusions aren't going to be peer reviewed. There's an approach that you can take that tries or seeks to be more, systematic and tries to isolate specific variables and trying to understand, the kind of relationships that exist between, why won't the tractor start? Well, the whole process of the combustion engine is being disrupted by a spark plug that isn't acting in such and such a way that we would expect, and so therefore the whole process is being disrupted.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and when you say it's not peer reviewed, is peer review necessary for science. What makes a peer? Like, at what point do some people come up with something that's so novel that it can't be peer reviewed? Or what if that scientist like comes up with this new method of planting crops and he says like, hey, can 5 of my other farm friends try it, and then like 10 of them try it, and like the whole farming community tries it? And so is that like not a sort of kind of peer review of whether the process works?
It's a kind of peer review, but it's not just a peer review, but it's a peer review that's relevant and specific to the context for which the work is being put, right? Like, you don't need the journal of the scientific journal of tractor repair.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So really, a lot of this stuff comes down to what we want, what we think science is, and it's been really hard, especially lately, to know what is science, what is not science.
It's a complicated question. I mean, hopefully, if there's listeners out there who aren't into philosophy or aren't into philosophy of science, maybe they can appreciate the plight of the struggling philosopher a bit more.
Yeah, maybe.
and the scientist who floats above it all, like, I don't care.
Yeah, I know I'm doing science.
Yeah, I don't need you.
Yeah. Or what if it's someone like me who like did science and now doesn't do science? Is it doing science if you're just learning it in your undergrad?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, are you I mean, it's kind of, I've often asked this about philosophy. What does it mean to be a philosopher?
Mm-hmm.
Do you, if you think about philosophy, are you a philosopher?
Yeah.
Or do you have to be peer reviewed to be a philosopher?
Yeah. Do you have to have certain features? Does it have to be relational?
It turns out philosophers don't exist, but philosophy does.
Yeah. It's just the practice, the relationship.
Yeah.
It's the doing of the philosophy.
The horrible dysfunctional practices of philosophers.
Yeah.
I'm joking, only to some extent.
Only to a little bit of an extent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, philosophers of science have been asking this question about like, what is real science? I don't know if we've actually turned that question back on ourselves and been like, what is philosophy?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. And what are you trying to do?
Yeah. What counts?
All right. Yeah. What not just what counts, but what should count.
Yeah.
I mean, if a relationship exists in the forest, but there's no mediating model to detect it, does it still exist?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. Is it just part of like this bigger higher level theory? Does that higher level theory exist? Does it not?
Yeah.
Is it this form floating around in the world? Was Aristotle right all along?
Yeah. It's funny how the more sort of nitty gritty and specific and technical you want to be, the more you still find yourself coming back to these larger problems that have kind of existed in philosophy for a long time.
Yeah, so maybe that's philosophy. Being able to circle back to a question that you've always had.
A giant circle.
Yeah.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, I think this week we've talked about science and how difficult it can be to both measure and also understand whether what exactly is real when we conduct experiments, and what is it that we're saying is real. Is it structures? Is it objects? It's not clear, but it's at least clear what the terms of the debate is. I think from our discussion. So
that's good. At least some of it's clear.
Well, we're a little bit. I mean, clear is always better than unclear. So
yeah,
clear is a relative term. So I want to thank Angela for being here again on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's
Yeah,
been fun.
thanks for joining me and engaging in this and sharing your research. It's fascinating. And
More than
hopefully,
happy to do it again.
yeah. We'll get, it'd be nice to maybe we'll get, get people back on after a few months and see if their minds have changed or and then you find out that you actually want to go into aesthetics instead.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm really into painting now.
What is food philosophy? What is a
Yeah.
sandwich?
Well, I mean, the biology still applies there, right?
That's true. That's true. I might
What
end up
is-
circling back.
Are we our own food?
The question.
What is food?
What is food? What is we?
Alrighty. Well, thanks for joining me again, and I guess we'll say goodbye.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yep. Okay, so this has been another episode of the Reconstructing Philosophy podcast. Join us again soon, and we'll be having more exciting philosophers from the region. So look for that in a few weeks. Okay.
Alrighty. Bye bye.